She was standing on the sidewalk outside the only home she had ever truly loved, holding a garbage bag that contained everything she had left in the world. It was a Tuesday in November, and the sky over Cookeville was the color of old pewter, low and heavy and pressing down on everything beneath it. The bag held 2 changes of clothes, a photograph in a cracked frame, a tin of peppermint candies Everett used to keep in his shirt pocket, and a Bible with her mother's handwriting in the margins. That was it. That was 74 years of living, compressed into something a child could carry. Garrett had changed the locks the night before. He hadn't done it himself. He'd sent a man Miriam had never seen, a young man with a utility belt and no expression, who arrived at 7 in the evening without knocking and was finished by 7:15. Miriam had been in the kitchen washing her dinner dishes when she heard the drilling. She dried her hands slowly on the dish towel, the yellow one, with the embroidered sunflowers that she had bought at a church sale in 1994, and she walked to the front door and stood there listening as the man worked, because some part of her already knew what was happening and didn't want to be surprised by it. She had asked him, quietly, what he was doing. He had said, "Ma'am, I'm just doing a job." And then he had left. Garrett's note was taped to the new lock. It was typed, not handwritten, which told Miriam everything she needed to know about how much thought he had put into this moment and how little feeling. It said that the property was now being managed under his authority as Everett's surviving next of kin, that her continued residence constituted an unauthorized occupancy, and that her personal belongings had been placed in a bag on the porch for her convenience. The word convenience sat in her chest like a stone. She had planted the rose bushes along that front fence in the spring of 1986. She had refinished the kitchen floor on her hands and knees while 7 months pregnant with a child she would later lose. She had held Everett's hand on the back porch every single summer evening for 38 years and watched the fireflies come up from the field like small private miracles. Her name was Miriam Estelle Brandt, and she had been erased from her own life so quietly that the neighbors hadn't even noticed. She stood there on that sidewalk for a long time. The wind came from the north and cut through her jacket like it meant to. The garbage bag made a soft rustling sound against her leg. Across the street, a dog barked twice and then went silent. No one came. No one called. She was completely alone. She would later say to the attorney, to the county clerk, to the woman at the historical preservation office, who would become something like a friend, that she had not cried on that sidewalk. Not because she wasn't broken, but because somewhere beneath the broken places, something quiet and stubborn had refused to go out entirely. A pilot light, the smallest possible flame. She didn't know it yet, but 40 minutes east of where she stood, on a road with no mailbox and no number, something was waiting for her. Something sealed. Something hidden. Something that Garrett Brandt had never thought to look for. He had taken almost everything. Almost. Miriam Estelle Brandt was born on the 14th of March, 1952, in a farmhouse outside of Sparta, Tennessee, the second of 4 children born to Wallace and June Pickett. The house had no insulation worth speaking of, and the wind came through the window frames in winter, with a sound like someone breathing slowly in the walls, but it was warm in the ways that mattered. Her mother kept a cast iron skillet on the stove from October to April, and there was almost always something in it: cornbread, or pinto beans, or the chicken Wallace had wrung that morning before dawn. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and rendered fat and the faint sweetness of sorghum molasses, and Miriam would carry that smell in her memory for the rest of her life as the smell of being safe. Wallace Pickett was a quiet man who expressed love through action rather than language. He taught Miriam to change a tire when she was 11, to read a county map when she was 12, and to back a truck down a narrow lane without checking the mirrors more than twice. He believed that a woman who could take care of herself would never be entirely at the mercy of anyone else. It was the most important thing he ever taught her, though neither of them would have put it in those words. June Pickett was different, softer in her gestures, quicker with her hands, the kind of woman who could him address and recite scripture and comfort a frightened child all at the same time without appearing to hurry. She sang in the kitchen, old hymns mostly, and the occasional Patsy Cline song when she thought no one was listening. Miriam absorbed all of it, her father's steadiness and her mother's warmth, and carried both of them into everything she ever did. She was not the prettiest girl in her school, and she knew it without being troubled by it. She was something better. She was capable and kind and quietly funny in a way that made people feel comfortable rather than performed for. She had good, strong hands and a clear, direct gaze, and she listened to people the way very few people are ever listened to, with her whole attention, as though whatever you were saying was the only thing happening in the world at that moment. Teachers noticed it, neighbors noticed it, and eventually, a 23-year-old man named Everett Raymond Brant noticed it too. She met Everett in the fall of 1973 at a church potluck dinner in Cookeville. He was not from Cookeville originally. He had grown up in White County, over near the Cumberland Plateau, in a family that had farmed the same land for 3 generations and spoke about that land the way some people speak about religion, with reverence and without irony. He had come to Cookeville for work, hired on at a small engine repair shop on the highway, and a friend had brought him to the potluck because he had been eating sandwiches alone in his rented room for 6 weeks, and it was starting to show in his face. He was tall and lean with dark hair going slightly unruly at the temples, and he had the careful, deliberate movements of a man who had spent his life around machinery and knew the cost of carelessness. Miriam had brought a sweet potato casserole to the dinner. Everett had come back for a second helping, and then a third, and when he finally looked up and found her watching him from across the table with an expression that was not quite amusement but was very close to it, he had the grace to look embarrassed. "It's the best thing I've eaten in 2 months," he said. It was not a line. It was simply true, and she could tell the difference. She laughed, and he laughed, and something between them settled into place with the ease of something that had always belonged there. They were married the following October on a Saturday afternoon in a small Baptist church with yellow chrysanthemums on the altar and rain on the windows and Miriam's mother crying quietly in the front pew. Miriam wore her grandmother's pearl earrings and a dress she had sewn herself from a pattern she had stayed up 3 nights to finish. She had pricked her finger so many times on the final hem that the fabric still bore a faint rust-colored mark near the seam, invisible to everyone but her. She knew exactly where it was. She considered it a kind of signature. They moved into a rented house in Cookeville first, a small place with a slanted porch and a landlord who appeared without warning to inspect the gutters. But Everett was saving, carefully and quietly, the way he did most things, and by 1978, they had enough for a down payment on 11 acres of mixed pasture and timberland just outside of town, with a farmhouse on it that needed more work than either of them had fully admitted to themselves before signing the papers. The roof leaked in 2 places. The back bedroom had a door that wouldn't latch. The well pump made a sound like a man clearing his throat every time you turned on the kitchen tap. They loved it completely. Everett worked on the house evenings and weekends for years, methodically, room by room. Miriam had taken the job with the county postal service by then. She had applied on a Tuesday and been hired by Thursday, and she took to the work with the same steady attention she gave to everything. She learned her routes the way you learn a piece of music, until she could drive them without thinking, until the road itself became a kind of rhythm. She knew which families put their flag up even when there was nothing to collect, just for the company of seeing the mail truck slow down. She knew which elderly men watched for her from the window. She left wildflowers when she had them, and notes when she didn't, and she never once in 31 years of service called in sick on a day when she knew someone on her route was waiting for a check that would decide whether they ate that week. Everett was a good husband. He was not a demonstrative man in public. He would not have known what to do with himself if he had been, but in private, he was tender in the specific and unhurried way of a man who has decided that one woman is everything and has never once second guessed the decision. He remembered the date of every anniversary without being reminded. He brought her coffee in bed on Saturday mornings, black with 1 spoon of honey, exactly the way she liked it, for 38 years without variation. When she had a hard day, he did not try to fix it. He sat with her. That was enough. That was more than enough. They had tried for children. This is the part of Miriam's story that she carried most quietly, the part she shared with almost no one, the part that had shaped her in ways that didn't show on the surface, but ran through everything underneath like a seam of something that has been pressed very hard and very long. She had been pregnant 3 times. The first pregnancy had ended at 14 weeks, in a hospital in Nashville, in a room with fluorescent lighting, and a nurse who was kind but exhausted. The second had lasted longer, almost to the 7th month, and the loss of that child, a daughter they had privately named Rose, had been the closest Miriam ever came to a darkness she could not find her way back from. She had taken a leave from her mail route. She had sat in the kitchen for 2 weeks and watched the birds at the feeder Everett had put up outside the window. Slowly, with patience, with Everett's hand in hers every evening and her mother's voice on the telephone every morning, she had found her way back. The 3rd pregnancy held a son, born in July of 1981, whom they named Thomas Wallace Brant Thomas for no particular reason except that it suited him, and Wallace for Miriam's father, who wept when he heard it. Thomas was a good boy. He grew into a thoughtful and somewhat solitary man, a surveyor by trade, who had moved to Asheville in his early 30s and called his mother every Sunday without fail. He had never been close to Garrett Everett's son from a brief first marriage that had ended before Miriam ever entered the picture, and had said so to Miriam plainly, more than once, in the years before everything fell apart. "I don't trust him, Mom," Thomas had said, the last Christmas they had all been in the same room together. "There's something off about the way he watches things." Miriam had told him not to borrow trouble. She wished later that she had listened instead. Everett's health began its slow decline in 2017. It started with a tiredness he couldn't shake, a heaviness in his chest that the doctors at first attributed to age and then, after more tests, did not. Congestive heart failure, managed but not curable, the kind of diagnosis that changes the light in a room permanently. Miriam cut her hours at the Postal Service and then retired fully in the spring of 2018, 3 years earlier than she had planned, because she would not leave him alone in the house for 8 hours a day with a heart that was running on reduced capacity. She did not resent the decision for a single moment. She would do it again without hesitation. Everett died on a Wednesday morning in February of 2020, quietly in their bedroom, with Miriam beside him and the winter light coming through the curtains they had hung together 20 years before. He had been declining for 3 days, and she had not left his side, When it happened, she sat with him for a long time before she called anyone. She held his hand and listened to the house, which was very quiet, and thought about all the Saturday mornings and the coffee with honey and the fireflies in the field. She thought about Rose. She thought about the first time she had made him laugh at that church potluck and the way his whole face had changed when he did, as though laughing was something he had forgotten he knew how to do. She thought, I have been so lucky. Even now, even here. Garrett arrived 4 days after the funeral. He said he had come to help. Garrett Brandt arrived on a Saturday with 2 suitcases, a pickup truck, and his wife Lacey, who had the particular kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes wide and immediate and somehow always slightly ahead of the conversation, as though she had already decided how things were going to go and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Miriam had met Lacey perhaps a dozen times over the years at holidays and the occasional family occasion, and she had always felt in Lacey's presence a faint, low-grade unease that she had never been able to name precisely, and so had never acted on. She was a woman who believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. It was one of her finest qualities. It was also the one that cost her everything. Garrett was 40 years old that February, stocky and dark-haired, like his father, but without Everett's stillness, without Everett's patience. He had his father's hands, but none of his father's gentleness with them. He worked in insurance sales in Nashville, and he was, by all appearances, moderately successful at it, which made sense to Miriam in a way she could not have explained. There was something in Garrett that understood how to make people feel protected right up until the moment they needed the protection, and found it wasn't there. She had never disliked him. She had never fully trusted him either. But he was Everett's son, and Everett had loved him in the complicated and slightly grieving way that fathers love children they were not present enough for, and so Miriam had always kept the door open. He said all the right things that first weekend. He said he was worried about her being alone. He said the property needed looking after. He said Lacey was between jobs and could be a real help around the house, cooking and cleaning and keeping Miriam company. He said it all warmly, reasonably, with the practiced cadence of a man accustomed to making proposals sound like kindnesses. Miriam, who was 68 years old and had just buried her husband of 46 years and was sitting in a house that felt 3 times too large and absolutely silent, said yes. Of course she said yes. She was grieving and she was tired, and they were standing in her kitchen offering her company, and she was too emptied out to see what she was actually being offered. The first thing Garrett did, 2 weeks after moving in, was suggest they open a joint bank account. He framed it practically, efficiently, the way he framed everything. Managing the household expenses would be easier, he said. Writing checks for the utilities and the property taxes and the insurance premiums from a shared account made more sense than Miriam having to handle all of it herself. He sat across from her at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pen, and he went through the numbers with her, line by line, and it all sounded entirely reasonable. The account would be in both their names, he said. She could see every transaction. It was just simpler. Miriam had looked at the legal pad with its columns of figures and thought of Wallace Pickett teaching her to read a county map, and some distant part of her had felt a small hesitation, a slight resistance, like a door catching on a warped frame. She had told herself she was being paranoid. She had signed the paperwork the following Thursday. Within 6 months, $14,000 had left that account in withdrawals and transfers that Garrett characterized, when she asked, as property maintenance costs, tax prepayments. and what he called a management fee for overseeing the estate. He showed her receipts, sometimes photocopied things, blurry around the edges, with the names of contractors she had never met for work she had never seen performed. When she pressed him on one particular withdrawal of $3,200 in September, he had sighed with a particular brand of patience that was indistinguishable from contempt, and said, "Miriam, we had the drainage field looked at. I told you about this." He had not told her about it. She was almost certain he had not told her about it. But she was not entirely certain, and that uncertainty, deliberately cultivated, she would understand later, was the gap through which everything else flowed. Lacey's contribution to the arrangement was subtler and in some ways more damaging. She rearranged the kitchen without asking, moving Miriam's things to higher shelves and lower drawers, to places that were slightly harder to reach, slightly less convenient, until Miriam found herself asking Lacey to get things for her, and then feeling, somehow, like a guest in her own home. Lacey cooked dinner most evenings, which sounded generous until you understood that it meant Miriam ate what Lacey chose, when Lacey chose, and sat at a table where the conversation was conducted by Lacey and Garrett at a pace and on topics that left Miriam nodding along the edges of discussions she had not been invited into. She began eating lunch alone in her bedroom. Then she began taking her morning coffee up there as well. Then she noticed that the bedroom had become the only room in the house where she felt like herself, and by that point the house itself had already stopped being hers in any meaningful way. Thomas called every Sunday, as he always had. Miriam told him things were fine. She told him this for 8 months because she did not want to worry him, and because some core of her Tennessee stubbornness refused to say the words out loud, as though naming the thing would make it more real than she could manage. Thomas, 400 miles away in Asheville, with his own work and his own life, heard what she said and not what she meant. That was not his fault. Miriam was very good at sounding fine. The second act of cruelty was more deliberate and more calculated than the first, and it happened in the spring of 2021, 14 months after Garrett and Lacey had arrived. Garrett came to her one evening with a document he described as an estate simplification agreement. He explained, unhurriedly, with his yellow legal pad and his columns of numbers, that the farmhouse and the 11 acres were currently encumbered by a complex probate situation. Everett's will had been straightforward, but the property transfer had created certain tax liabilities, he said. Certain complications that a formal transfer of management authority would resolve. He used the word simplification 4 times in 10 minutes. The document, he said, would give him authority to manage the property on her behalf, to handle any necessary sales or transfers for tax purposes, and to act as her designated representative in any county or state filings related to the estate. Miriam read the document, or she tried to. It was 4 pages of dense legal language that seemed to loop back on itself, and when she asked Garrett to explain a particular clause on the 3rd page, the one that referred to transfer of beneficial interest, he had smiled patiently and said that was just standard legal boilerplate. It didn't mean anything particular. It was just the way these documents were written. He said she could have a lawyer look at it if she wanted. And then he had paused just briefly and added that, of course, that would cost money, and given the current state of the joint account, it might not be the most practical use of their resources right now. She had signed the document the following morning. She signed it because she was 70 years old and exhausted, and she trusted that Everett's son would not do to her what Everett's son was doing to her. She was wrong. She was catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. By the fall of 2021, the joint account held less than $4,000. Miriam had begun to notice that her own Social Security deposits, which went into that account, were being absorbed within days of arrival against what expenses, she was no longer entirely sure. When she asked Garrett directly, one evening in October, standing in the kitchen she had cooked in for 40 years, he told her with a flat and final calmness that she did not fully understand her own financial situation and that he was managing it as best he could given the circumstances. The circumstances, he implied, were her fault, her age, her inability to manage a property of this size, her dependence. He said the word dependence only once, but he placed it very carefully, the way you place something fragile on a shelf where it will be seen. She called an attorney the next morning from her bedroom, quietly, with the door closed. She found a name in the phone book, an old habit, and called and explained the situation in a low and even voice. The attorney, a woman named Patricia Oakes with an office on the courthouse square, listened and then asked her to come in. Miriam said she would need to arrange her own transportation because she no longer had regular access to the car. There was a brief silence on the line. Then Patricia Oakes said, "Mrs. Brandt, come in tomorrow morning. First thing. Don't sign anything else between now and then." She never made it to that appointment. That evening, Garrett came to her room and sat down uninvited, on the edge of the chair by the window with his hands folded and his voice at its most reasonable, and told her that he had spoken to Patricia Oakes' office and had explained the family situation, and that it was probably best if Miriam worked through him on any legal matters going forward given the complexity of the estate. He said this pleasantly, cheerfully even. He said it the way you might tell someone you had picked up their dry cleaning. Miriam looked at him for a long moment and understood, with a clarity that arrived too late and too cold, exactly who she was dealing with. She did not call Patricia Oakes again. She was afraid of what Garrett would do. That was the first time she had been afraid of him, and the fear, once it arrived, did not leave. The final act came in August of 2022. A letter arrived hand-delivered by the same expressionless young man who would later change her locks, informing her that due to the management transfer agreement she had signed the previous spring, the farmhouse property was being listed for a private sale and that her continued residence would be accommodated through the end of the month. The end of the month was 11 days away. The letter was signed by Garrett in his capacity as designated estate manager. It was typed. It was formal. It was entirely, devastatingly legal, or appeared to be. Thomas called when she told him. He drove up from Asheville and sat with her and said things that were true and useful and about 3 years too late. He talked about lawyers, about contesting the transfer agreement, about options. Miriam listened and nodded and knew in her bones that by the time any of it moved through any legal channel, she would be old enough that it would not matter. The system moved slowly and money moved fast, and Garrett had had 2 years to make his arrangements. On the last day of August 2022, Miriam Estelle Brandt carried a garbage bag out of the house she had lived in for 44 years and stood on the sidewalk while the wind came from the north and cut through her jacket like it meant to. She had $2,200 in a personal savings account. Garrett didn't know about money she had moved there quietly over the final weeks, $20 at a time, the way her father had taught her to be careful without being seen being careful. It was enough for 3 months' rent on the room above the laundromat on Walnut Street. It was not enough for anything else. She was alone. She was erased. She was standing at the bottom of everything. But the pilot light had not gone out. It was Thomas who found the tobacco barn, though he didn't know that was what he had found. He had driven up from Asheville on a Thursday in late October, 6 weeks after Miriam had moved into the room above the laundromat, and he had brought her a bag of groceries and a box of her mother's china that he had been storing in his apartment since before Everett died. He sat with her for 2 hours in that small room, the radiator ticking against the far wall, the smell of detergent rising through the floorboards from the laundromat below, warm and chemical and oddly comforting, and they talked about practical things, because practical things were easier than the other kind. At some point, Thomas pulled out a folder and set it on the small table between them. He had been going through Everett's old papers, he said. The ones Miriam had kept in the cedar chest in the spare room, the ones Garrett had apparently not considered worth taking because they were old and unorganized and looked like nothing important. Thomas had taken the cedar chest with him on his last visit, quietly, without announcing it to anyone. Most of the papers were exactly what they appeared to be: receipts, old tax filings, correspondence with the county extension office about a fence line dispute that had been resolved before Miriam and Everett were married. But Thomas had found something else at the very bottom of the chest, tucked inside a manila envelope that had been sealed with a strip of masking tape gone yellow and brittle with age. It was a photograph, black and white, slightly overexposed, showing a man standing in front of a small stone structure, a cottage, or the beginning of one, with his hand resting on the corner of a door frame and an expression that was not quite smiling, but was close to it. On the back of the photograph, in Everett's handwriting, were 4 words: the Harlan Place. 1971, Miriam had held the photograph for a long time. The radiator ticked. The detergent smell rose and fell. She had turned the photograph over and looked at the young man standing at the doorframe and recognized Everett at 21 before she had ever known him, standing on land he had never once mentioned to her by name. Thomas had done the research. He was a surveyor by trade, and county records were his native language, and what he found in the White County Assessor's office took him less than an afternoon to uncover. A parcel of 14 acres, originally belonging to Raymond Harlan Brant Everett's father, listed in county records under the notation E.R. Brant Estate, sole heir, designated by private instrument. No joint filing. No secondary names. No record of it ever having been included in any probate proceeding connected to Everett's death, because no one had ever thought to look for it. Garrett had combed through the farmhouse for 2 years with the thoroughness of a man who believed he had found everything worth finding. He had never known this land existed. Thomas had written the address on a piece of paper and pushed it across the table to Miriam. He said, "Mom, I think you need to go there." She went on a Friday morning, alone, because she wanted it that way. Thomas had offered to drive her, and she had said no, gently and firmly, the way she said things when she had decided. She borrowed a neighbor's car, an elderly woman named Cora Stills, who lived 2 doors down from the laundromat and who had become, in 6 weeks, something approaching a friend, and she drove east on the highway toward the Cumberland Plateau, with Thomas's paper on the passenger seat and the pale October sun coming through the windshield at a low angle that made her visor useless and lit up the road in long golden strips. She found the turnoff 40 minutes later, a gravel lane barely wide enough for the car, unmarked except for a rusted metal post with no sign on it, the sign itself long since rotted or fallen or taken. She turned in and drove slowly, the gravel popping under the tires, the lane curving between stands of cedar and persimmon with their fruit still hanging, small and orange and incongruous against the gray bark, like decorations left over from something. The lane opened after a quarter mile into a clearing, and the clearing held 3 things: a small stone cottage with a pitched tin roof gone green with lichen, a stand of old oak trees whose leaves had turned the color of dried blood, and at the far edge of the clearing, A tobacco barn, dark and weathered, leaning slightly eastward, as though it had spent decades listening to something in that direction. Miriam stopped the car and sat for a moment. The engine ticked as it cooled. Through the windshield, the cottage looked small and still and somehow patient, the way old structures look when they have been waiting a long time for someone who belongs there. She could hear nothing except the wind moving through the oaks and the faint dry rattle of the remaining leaves. The air, when she opened the door, smelled of cold earth and cedar and the faint sweetness of the persimmons, and beneath all of that something else would smoke, old and deeply embedded. As though the cottage itself retained the memory of every fire ever lit inside it, she went to the cottage first. The door was unlocked. There was no lock on it, only a simple iron latch, and it swung open with the low groan of a hinge that had not moved in years. Inside it was a single main room with a stone fireplace on the north wall, 2 windows with no glass in them, a plank floor gray with age and gritty underfoot, a wooden table, 2 chairs, mismatched, still standing at the table, as though whoever had last sat there had simply stepped out for a moment and not yet returned. The light came through the empty window frames in long, clean rectangles and lay on the floor in silence. It was cold inside and smelled of stone and dry timber and time. She stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly, the way you turn in a space you are trying to understand. It was not the farmhouse. It was nothing like the farmhouse. It was smaller and rougher and stripped of everything comfortable. And yet something in it was familiar. Something in the proportions or the light or the smell of the old stone, something that sat in her chest with a weight that was not grief and not happiness, but some specific combination of both that she did not have a word for. She went back out into the clearing and walked toward the tobacco barn. The barn doors were 2 large sliding panels of weathered board, gray as driftwood. The wood so dry it no longer smelled of wood, but of something more mineral, more permanent. One panel was stuck in its track, and she had to put her shoulder to it and push with her full weight before it gave, grudgingly, with a sound like a long-held breath released. Inside, the light came in narrow and angled through gaps in the siding, falling in pale bars across the dirt floor and the old tobacco hanging racks overhead, dark with decades of curing smoke. The smell was extraordinary, dense and sweet and ancient, molasses and earth and something faintly medicinal, the ghost of every tobacco crop that had ever hung in this air. Miriam breathed it in and stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. She had come into the barn with no specific purpose. She had come because it was there, and because she was the kind of woman who wanted to see everything that belonged to a place she was trying to understand. She walked slowly along the near wall, running her hand along the rough boards, feeling the dry splinter of old wood under her fingertips. At the far corner, where 2 walls met at a right angle and the dirt floor gave way to a section of old plank flooring installed, she guessed, to keep equipment dry, she stopped. One of the planks was wrong. She couldn't have said, at first, exactly what was wrong about it. It was the same gray weathered wood as the rest of the floor section, the same rough grain, the same age, but it sat slightly higher than the planks on either side of it, just enough to catch the light differently, and when she pressed the toe of her shoe against it, there was a faint hollow sound beneath, not the dense thud of packed earth, but the brief resonant echo of empty space. She stood very still. Her heart was doing something she had not felt it do in a long time, not the heart-alarmed pounding of fear, but something slower and more deliberate, a deep, insistent thudding, as though her body had recognized something her mind was still catching up to. The light came through the barn wall in those narrow, pale bars and lay across her hands and the floor and the wrong plank in equal silence. She knelt down. Her knees protested, they always did now, the left more than the right, and she pressed her palms flat against the plank and pushed down on one end. It tipped, easily, pivoting on a hidden central point, and the end nearest her lifted free of the floor. She took hold of it with both hands and lifted it entirely clear. Beneath the plank was a space roughly the size of a small suitcase, shored up on three sides with fitted lengths of 2x4, clearly hand-built, clearly intentional. And in that space, resting on a folded piece of oilcloth, gone stiff with age, was a tin box, army green, dented at the left corner. Stamped on the lid in black paint, the letters slightly faded but entirely legible, ERB Miriam sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. The barn was quiet around her except for the wind finding the gaps in the siding and the faint creak of the hanging racks overhead. Her hands were resting on her thighs, and she could see that they were trembling, a fine, continuous trembling, not from cold, but from something else. Something that had no name yet. She thought of Everett's face in the photograph, young and unsmiling and standing at the cottage door frame with his hand on the wood. She thought of 46 years of Saturday mornings and coffee with honey. She thought of all the things a person can carry in silence for a lifetime because they are waiting for the right moment or the right person or the right reason to set them down. She reached into the space and lifted the tin box out. It was heavier than she expected, not enormously heavy, but solid, weighted with contents that shifted almost imperceptibly when she tilted it, the faint whisper of paper against metal. The lid was sealed around its edge with a bead of old candle wax, ivory-colored and slightly crumbled, but still continuous, still unbroken. No one had opened this box since the wax was laid. She was certain of that. She carried it to the barn door, into the light, and set it on the ground and sat down cross-legged in the cold October grass beside it, like a child beside a Christmas present she is almost afraid to open. The persimmon trees stood at the edge of the clearing. The oaks moved in the wind. A crow called once from somewhere in the tree line, and then was silent. She broke the wax seal with her thumbnail, slowly, working around the circumference of the lid. It came away in small curved fragments that fell into the grass. She set the lid aside. Inside the box, wrapped in a second piece of oilcloth, was a packet of documents held together with a length of kitchen twine, knotted twice. On top of the packet, loose and unfolded, was a single sheet of paper covered in Everett's handwriting. The same handwriting she had read on birthday cards and grocery lists and the backs of photographs for 46 years. She unfolded it. It began, Miriam. If you are reading this, then you found the photograph. I always knew you would if you needed to. She stopped reading. She pressed the paper flat against her chest with both hands and closed her eyes and sat in the cold October grass for a long time, breathing. The wind moved through the oaks. The tin box sat open beside her, waiting. The persimmons hung small and orange against the gray bark of their trees, patient and bright. When she opened her eyes, she read the rest. Everett had written 4 pages in the careful, unhurried hand of a man who had thought about what he wanted to say and was saying it the only way he knew directly, without ornament, with complete attention. He had bought the White County parcel from his father's estate in 1987, he wrote, using money he had saved separately over 15 years from small jobs and careful habits that Miriam had never asked about because she trusted him. which was, he wrote, one of the 10,000 things he loved about her. He had always intended the property as a last resort, a hidden thing, because he had grown up in a family that believed in having something no one else knew about, a place that was fully and only yours. He had not told her about it because he wanted the knowing to belong entirely to her if she ever needed it. He had gone to the county clerk's office on a Tuesday in October of 1987 and had the deed drawn up and notarized in her name alone, Miriam Estelle Brandt, sole owner, no encumbrances, no secondary parties. He had placed it in this box and sealed it and hidden it here because he knew, with the certainty of a man who understood what he was doing, that this barn on this land was the one place no one who had not grown up Brandt would ever think to look. The deed was beneath his letter, still crisp inside its oilcloth wrapping, notarized and dated October 14th, 1987, her 35th birthday. She had not known, all those years ago, what he had given her. She had not known she was already holding it. She read the deed through twice, slowly, her finger tracing the lines. Her name, the parcel description, the notary stamp, still sharp and clear after 35 years. Sole owner, no conditions, no expiration. Hers, the sound she made then, was not a sob exactly, and not a laugh. It was something older than either of those things, a sound that came from somewhere deep in the body, from the place where grief and relief and love all press against each other until they can no longer be told apart. It rose out of her and into the cold October air, and the crows in the tree line answered it, and then there was silence again. And the wind, and the persimmons, and Miriam Estelle Brandt sitting in the grass of land that had been hers for 35 years, without her knowing it. Everett had known. Everett had always known. He had built her a way out of a darkness he could not have named or predicted, and he had sealed it with wax and hidden it with care, and trusted her completely to find it if she needed to. She needed to. She sat there until the light began to change, until the long October shadows stretched across the clearing, and the air went colder and the tin box sat open beside her with its oilcloth and its twine and its 35-year-old secret finally given to the air. Then she folded Everett's letter carefully along its original creases and placed it back in the box and closed the lid and picked up the box and walked to the car. She drove back toward Cookville in the long golden light of late afternoon with the tin box on the passenger seat where Thomas's paper had been that morning, and she did not cry again. She was past crying. She was somewhere on the other side of crying, in a place that was quieter and cleaner and entirely her own. She called Thomas that evening from the room above the laundromat, sitting on the edge of the bed with the tin box on the table beside her and the radiator ticking its slow, reliable rhythm against the wall. She did not lead with drama. She simply said, "Thomas, I need you to find me a property attorney in White County, a good one, someone who knows land records." There was a pause on the line, and then Thomas said, "Mom, what did you find?" And she said everything, and left it at that. The attorney's name was Gerald Foss, and he had an office in Sparta that smelled of old coffee and wood polish and the particular dusty warmth of a room full of physical files in an era when most people had gone entirely digital. He was in his early 60s, gray-bearded, unhurried, with the quiet authority of a man who had spent 4 decades watching people try to do things to land that land did not agree to. He looked at the deed for a long time without speaking, turning it carefully by its edges, examining the notary stamp with a magnifying glass he kept on his desk for exactly this kind of purpose. Then he set it down and folded his hands and looked at Miriam across the desk with an expression that was professional and controlled but contained, beneath its surface, something that might have been satisfaction. "This is a valid deed," he said. "Properly executed, properly notarized, recorded in the White County Register of Deeds on October 22nd, 1987. I'll pull the register copy to confirm, but I can tell you right now that this document conveys sole and unencumbered title to Miriam Estelle Brandt." He paused. "That's you?" She said yes. That was her. He nodded once, as though something had been confirmed that he had already known. "Mrs. Brandt," he said, "whoever handled the Everett Brandt estate probate missed this entirely. This parcel was never included in any probate inventory I can find, which means it transferred to you at the time of purchase in 1987, not at Everett's death, and it was never subject to any estate management authority of any kind." He looked at her steadily. "No one had any legal right to this property except you. They simply didn't know it existed." Miriam had known this in the bones of her since the moment she had read Everett's letter in the grass of the clearing. But hearing it spoken aloud in a wood-paneled office by a man with a magnifying glass and 40 years of land law in his hands made it real in a different way, made it solid and irreversible and documented. She felt the weight of it settle into her shoulders and stay there, not as a burden but as ballast, as something that would keep her upright. Gerald Foss filed the necessary paperwork with the White County Register of Deeds within the week. He also sent a certified letter to Garrett Brandt at the Cookville farmhouse, written in the precise and airless language of property law, informing him that the White County parcel had been confirmed as the sole property of Miriam Estelle Brandt under a valid 1987 deed, that no claim of any kind could be made against it under any estate management agreement pertaining to the Everett Brandt estate, and that Mrs. Brandt's attorney would be in contact regarding certain other financial matters pending review. The letter was 2 pages long. It was careful and complete and left no room for interpretation. Thomas told Miriam later that Garrett had called him the afternoon the letter arrived. He had called from the farmhouse, Thomas said, and his voice had had a quality in it that Thomas had never heard before, not anger exactly, and not quite fear, but something between the two, a kind of compressed and disbelieving fury, the sound of a man who has built something carefully on a foundation he was certain was solid, discovering that the foundation had never existed. He had said, "What has she done?" And Thomas had said, quietly, "She hasn't done anything. Garrett, she found what was already hers." There had been a long silence on the line. Then, Garrett had said something Thomas chose not to repeat to Miriam, and Thomas had ended the call. Lacey called Miriam directly 2 days later. Miriam answered because she had decided she would answer, because she was no longer afraid, and she wanted Lacey to know she was no longer afraid. Lacey's voice was different on the phone than it had ever been in person, thinner, faster, stripped of the wide preemptive smile that had no warmth in it. She said that there must be some misunderstanding, that the family should sit down together, that surely Miriam didn't want things to become adversarial. Miriam listened to all of it without interrupting, the way she had listened to people her whole life, with her full attention. When Lacey finished, Miriam said, "Lacey, I don't think we need to meet. I think Gerald Foss has said everything that needs to be said." Then she said goodbye and set the phone down on the table next to the tin box and sat for a moment in the quiet room above the laundromat, listening to the detergent smell rise through the floorboards, and felt something in her chest release that she had been holding for 2 years without fully knowing she was holding it. Gerald Foss had also, in those same weeks, begun a separate review of the joint account transactions at Miriam's request. What he found, working with a financial examiner he brought in from Nashville, was a record of $38,000 withdrawn over 26 months through a pattern of transactions that the examiner described, in writing, as consistent with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The management fee transfers, the blurry contractor receipts, the drainage field that had never been inspected, all of it documented, all of it traceable. Gerald Foss sent a second letter. This one went to the district attorney's office in Putnam County, accompanied by 37 pages of supporting documentation. Miriam did not have to testify at length or appear at any hearing. Gerald Foss handled the language. She simply answered questions when asked and told the truth, which she had always found to be the least complicated approach to most things. Garrett did not go to prison. Miriam had not expected him to, and she did not require it. What happened was this. He was required to repay $31,400 of the withdrawn funds through a civil settlement negotiated by Gerald Foss on Miriam's behalf, structured as monthly payments over 4 years. The farmhouse, which Garrett had by then sold through a private arrangement, was found to have been sold under a management authority that Gerald Foss successfully argued had been obtained through undue influence, and while the sale itself could not be undone, a portion of the proceeds was recovered and returned to Miriam. It was not everything. It was not justice in the clean and absolute sense that the word sometimes implies, but it was real, and it was documented, and it had Garrett's signature on it. That was enough. Miriam moved to the White County property on the first Saturday of December, the year she turned 73. Thomas drove up from Asheville with his truck and 2 friends, and they brought her belongings, which were still not many, but were more than a garbage bag, now down from the room above the laundromat, and loaded them into the truck bed while Cora Still stood on the sidewalk in her coat and pressed a jar of her blackberry preserves into Miriam's hands and told her to call when she arrived. Miriam said she would. She did. The drive to White County took 40 minutes on a morning that was cold and clear. The sky a hard winter blue that looked almost brittle, and the fields along the highway held a thin skin of frost that caught the early light and gave it back as something almost silver. When she turned onto the gravel lane and felt the tires find the familiar pop of the loose stones, something in her settled the same way it had settled the first time she drove this road deeply, without announcement, the way things settle when they are returning to where they belong. The cottage had been made weathertight by a local contractor Gerald Foss had recommended, a quiet, competent man named Dale Purvis, who had replaced the window glass and repaired the tin roof and installed a small wood stove in the main room that threw heat generously into every corner. The plank floor had been cleaned, but not refinished. Miriam had asked for that specifically. She wanted the age in it. She wanted to feel what had always been there when she walked across it. She stood in the doorway with the winter light coming in through the new glass and the smell of the old stone around her and the wood stove already lit. Thomas had arrived ahead of her to light it, and the warmth coming forward to meet her like something alive. The 2 mismatched chairs were still at the table. She had asked Dale to leave them. She set Everett's tin box on the table between the chairs, where it had lived since the day she brought it home from the barn, and she stood and looked at it for a moment, and then she went back outside to help Thomas unload the truck. In the weeks that followed, she settled into the cottage with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman who has decided where she is going to be and does not intend to be anywhere else. She hung her mother's china on hooks along the kitchen wall. She put Everett's photograph, the young man standing at the doorframe, hand on the wood on the mantel above the wood stove, where she could see it from the table. She put her Bible, with her mother's handwriting in the margins, on the windowsill where the morning light fell first. She called Cora Stills on Sunday evenings. She drove into Sparta on Wednesdays for groceries and the particular pleasure of a cup of coffee at the counter of a diner on the courthouse square, where the woman who worked mornings knew her order by the third week and had it ready when she came through the door. She walked the 14 acres in the afternoons when the weather allowed, learning the land the way she had learned her mail routes, by repetition, by attention, until it became a rhythm in her body that she could carry without thinking. There was a creek at the eastern boundary that ran clear over flat limestone and made a sound in the cold air that she found she could sit beside for a very long time without needing anything else. She planted bulbs along the south wall of the cottage in early spring, daffodils and tulips and 2 varieties of crocus she had found at a nursery in Sparta run by a man who knew their names in Latin and seemed genuinely pleased that she wanted to know them too. She pressed the bulbs into the cold ground with her bare hands, one by one, feeling the soil give and close around each one, and thought about her father teaching her to read a county map and her mother singing Patsy Cline in the kitchen, and Everett at 21 standing at this very doorframe with his hand on the wood and something in him already deciding, already knowing, already keeping faith with a future he could not see, but trusted anyway. The daffodils came up in March, yellow and deliberate and completely indifferent to everything that had happened. They came up the way things come up when they have been planted with care in good ground and simply given time. Miriam Estelle Brandt stood at her kitchen window on a Tuesday morning in late March and watched them and drank her coffee black with 1 spoon of honey and felt the stone cottage solid around her and the 14 acres extending outward in every direction that was hers, only hers, sealed and hidden and waiting for her all along. She did not gloat. She did not make calls. She simply lived. And in the living of it, the quietest and most complete reversal imaginable had already taken place. On a Wednesday morning in late April, Miriam Estelle Brandt sits at the table in her stone cottage in White County, Tennessee, with a cup of coffee going warm between her hands and the tin box in its place between the 2 mismatched chairs and the window light falling across the plank floor in long, clean rectangles, exactly the way it did the first morning she stood here and understood that she was home. The wood stove has been cold for 3 weeks now. Spring came early this year, insistent and unhurried, the way good things come when they are ready, and the window is open an inch, and through that inch comes the smell of the creek and the wet limestone and the daffodils along the south wall, still going, still yellow, still entirely indifferent to everything that is not the simple fact of their own blooming. She is not doing anything remarkable this morning. She is drinking her coffee and watching a pair of cardinals in the oak tree at the edge of the clearing, the male impossibly red against the new green of the leaves, the female quieter and more considered in her colors, both of them going about the absolute ordinary business of being alive in the world. This is what her mornings look like now. This is what her life looks like now. Ordinary and specific and completely, irrevocably hers. Think about what it took to arrive at this morning. Think about the woman who stood on a sidewalk in November with a garbage bag and the wind coming from the north and not a single person coming to stand beside her. Think about the 46 years of coffee with honey and Saturday mornings and fireflies rising from a field that was taken from her by someone who had looked at her life and seen only what he could extract from it. Think about the sealed tin box and a tobacco barn on land that no one knew existed, waiting in the dark beneath a false floor for 35 years, patient as limestone, faithful as a creek. Everett Brant had understood something that Garrett never did and never will, that the most powerful things are not the things that announce themselves. They are the things that wait. The deed in the oilcloth, the letter in the careful handwriting, the pilot light that does not go out. Miriam had carried all of these things without knowing she was carrying them, and when she needed them, they were there, exactly as they had always been, sealed and hidden and unchanged by everything that had tried to undo her. She is 74 years old, and she is sitting in a cottage that smells of old stone and new spring and the faint sweet ghost of decades of curing tobacco from the barn at the edge of the clearing, and she is watching cardinals in an oak tree, and she has outlasted every single thing that was done to her. Not through triumph, not through revenge, through the quiet, stubborn, entirely unglamorous act of continuing, of being still here, of planting bulbs in cold ground and waiting for March. There's a woman somewhere reading this right now, or a man, or someone who has sat exactly where Miriam sat on that November sidewalk, with everything reduced to what fits in a single bag, and this story is for that person specifically. Not as a promise that things will resolve cleanly or quickly or without cost. They may not, but as a reminder that the sealed things, the hidden things, the things that were put away with care by someone who loved you, or by your own hands in a moment of foresight you have since forgotten, those things have a way of surviving. They have a way of waiting. They have a way of being exactly where you left them when you finally go looking. The cardinals are still in the oak tree. The coffee is still warm. The daffodils are still yellow along the south wall of the stone cottage on 14 acres in White County, Tennessee, that belonged to Miriam Estelle Brant and to no one else. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe, because every week we bring you stories that remind us that even in the darkest moments, something extraordinary may still be waiting.